Okay, so we are back talking about intrinsic emotion regulation, and one of the easiest ways to introduce or talk about the different strategies is to maybe give a specific example. And so here I am using a very basic model that has been used a lot in the affective science literature. And if we think about a situation coming up, situation arising, and that might help us think of where in the situation we can intervene and what strategies would be helpful during each of these kind of different time periods. So let's take the example of running into your ex on campus. So say that you are walking to class and you see your ex, and so that's the situation coming right here. There are a number of things that you can do. So first thing you can do is you could turn around and avoid the situation of running into your ex. So you're just not even going to engage in it. You might continue down your path, but you might say, look at your phone to distract yourself. You might continue down your path and you might say, okay, I'm gonna see this as an opportunity to show that I'm okay, and that there's no hard feelings. Like, here's an opportunity for me. So that's an appraisal. You're kind of processing almost the situation. You might, continue down the path and then say you're really, really anxious. You might purposely try to look relaxed and suppress any sort of hint that you're anxious on your face or in your body. So that's just, kind of one example. And so what happens though, so we talked about the situation selection. We can just opt to not engage in the situation. Situation modification refers to how do we change the actual environment of the situation. This example, not a ton we can do. Attentional deployment, that's how do we manipulate our attention so we're not really focusing on the thing that's giving us emotional distress. Cognitive change, really focusing on processing the meaning of the situation. And response modulation, again, really thinking about, okay, I'm going to change my response to this, my behavior to this. But, all of these solutions we talked about are good. They would work. You could just turn around and go the other way. You could look at your phone. All of that sounds like it would work, but one of the things I want to talk about, what if this is a situation where it's going to reoccur? You and your ex are going to be crossing paths regularly, say like every Wednesday at a certain time, because that's just when they're getting to class and you're getting to class or something, or I think that might change a little bit about how we might manage our emotions. It gives us another context to think about. So we talked about avoiding the situation, changing the situation. So distraction, that's like things like looking at the phone. We might ruminate, that's like really just focusing on, oh my gosh, I can't believe this is happening, and just really fixating on the situation. Mindfulness, again, uses our attention. You might engage in a mindful activity, connecting with your breath. Grounding activities are often mindful. So that, again, takes some attention away from the situation. You might reappraise. So the reappraisal is like looking at that silver lining, saying, oh, hey, maybe this is not such a bad thing. We can, maybe try to be friends or be friendly. Acceptance is going, okay, this is going to happen. I'm going to run into my ex, and I know that I'm going to be anxious about it, and that's okay. So that's acceptance. And the last one we talked about was suppression, where we are kind of changing our expression. So again, we need to think about if this situation is just coming up over and over again. That's gonna give us information on what strategies we might focus on. I do want to talk about situation modification, which often gets left out in the literature, and also situation selection. So situation selection might be like just avoiding the situation altogether or changing the situation. Say that you are in a really toxic working environment. You might decide to quit because every time you go in, you're having this really negative experience. That's a really smart way to manage emotions, especially something really highly impacting you, especially if you have the ability to change the situation. If you have a way to modify a situation, that can work too. So, say you're walking around to take the bus, but there is a house you pass with, a house that you pass with a dog that, is really scary and barks and whatnot. You might modify the situation by, say, giving that dog a toy, adding something to maybe that situation. Another one is cleaning up your room before, say, someone comes to your house. So those are also very viable strategies. We're going to go a little bit more deeply into these different strategies here. So we can kind of get more in depth and also talk about the pros and cons, things to consider for these strategies. So when we're talking about distraction, we're really talking about using our attention. So say we're supposed to be attending on this, well, we're redirecting our attention to something else. Examples of this: listening to music, watching TV, listening to a podcast. That's can be a very good way to engage our attention away from the thing that's causing the distress. And it's often less effortful. It takes less effort to do this. So example is, say I'm on a bus and someone really loud and someone's yelling and they're saying all sorts of things that are making me uncomfortable. I might distract by putting on my headphones and listening to some music. It's a very, very good example of using distraction wisely. Say that person is just someone who usually is not on the bus and they just happen to get on the bus today. Okay, so mindfulness and grounding also engages in attention, and it's somewhat effortful. So I put mindfulness - grounding because a lot of times when in a clinical setting, we might talk about mindfulness as grounding, talking about grounding activities, meaning that we might have you try to reconnect with the here and now and not, reconnect with the here and now and kind of ground you into the moment. It's really good for high intensity situations. So an example is, say, a client comes in, they're really stressed out about work, and they're telling me that when I'm in class, I feel really stressed out about work, and I can't focus on what the instructor is saying. And this is causing me a lot of stress. One of the things we might do is an activity where you take, say, an object in your hand, and you start engaging in some nice deep breathing where you're breathing in through your stomach, inhaling and filling the lungs in your chest, and then slowly pushing the air out through your nose. So inhaling through the nose and then exhaling through the nose. And as you exhale nice and slow and twice as long as you inhale. And while you're doing this, you're holding an object in your hand. Say you're holding a pen. While you hold this pen, you're going to ask yourself some questions about the way it feels. Maybe your eyes are closed. So you might ask yourself, what does this pen feel like? Is it heavy or light? Is it smooth or rigid? What are the shapes I can feel? What's the sensation of the pen on my skin? And etc. And really, it's getting you connected back to the moment using that object in your hand. And it's something you can engage in for 30 seconds. You can engage in it for 1 minute, 2 minutes. And it often helps us kind of recalibrate our attention to be like, oh yeah, I'm here right now. It also gives us a chance to redirect our attention from whatever's stressing us out, gives us a break, put it down, and by doing that, we might feel a little bit better. And there's a ton of mindfulness and grounding activities. One of my favorites is just getting a really hot cup of water or tea and holding that in my hand and like slowly sipping, feeling the warm liquid in my mouth and my throat, and very soothing. So there's, you can look up mindful or grounding activities, and you might find a lot here. So reappraisal, we've talked about this a little bit before, but it's exactly how it sounds. Reappraise. You're looking at something again, really engaging in your feelings, and trying to kind of evaluate the situation. It's a meaning-based strategy, meaning you are processing the actual content of what is going on, the impact. This takes a lot of effort. So if we go back to that example of running into your ex, when you reappraise, you really gotta acknowledge and understand what's going on, the impact of that. So maybe it's, this is really hard for me seeing my ex because I was really heartbroken when we broke up. And I'm really anxious right now. And you might reappraise by saying, well, I guess this is an opportunity for me to become less anxious and move on. And so it takes effort, and it decreases negative emotions and can increase positive emotions. It either doesn't impact or it decreases our sympathetic nervous system activity, meaning that it can make us feel calmer. Reappraisal is oftentimes like looking at the silver lining. It can be very, very helpful. The next is acceptance. So it's also meaning-based. We're looking at the situation, our experience of the situation. We're sitting with it. It is very, very effortful. It's a little more abstract. It decreases negative emotions and often can decrease sympathetic nervous system activity, meaning it often leaves us feeling more calm. It's really good for situations you can't change, or situations where you can't use reappraisal. So for example, say that your cat passed away, or say my cat passed away. I would not want to use reappraisal because there's no way that I can look at the silver lining and feel better. Because I'm really just feeling the loss. I'm feeling this grief, We could say things like, oh, well, the cat lived a long life. Well, that doesn't really help me feel less sad about what's happening. So reappraisal isn't a good strategy, and acceptance might be the one that kind of gives me more space to hold my feelings, to acknowledge my feelings, and we really want to be careful what we use acceptance on. I'm going to get into that because I think acceptance often gets confused with things like forgiveness or letting go or not caring. Acceptance really is just sitting with our thoughts, feelings, experience, emotions without changing them, being okay with whatever is happening with your experience, with your emotions, with your thoughts. So it's very, very effortful, and it is something that I do work on in a clinical setting that takes time and skill to build up. Okay, so reappraisal and acceptance are often considered gold standard because of exactly, going back to this, because when you go to this example again, where if something is happening over and over again, oftentimes distraction is not going to be enough. Because with reappraisal and acceptance, we change the way we experience the situation. It reduces the intensity of the situation if it comes up again, because we're actually reprocessing the situation. But you really need to have your internal resources, from that sleep, physical activity, and food to do this. Okay, so looking at this, let's talk about that example. Because I just said a lot of things and you might be going, what do you mean by all that? Okay, let's go back to our example of running into our ex. If we're always running into our ex, every Wednesday, say at 2 o'clock, we run into our ex. Okay, if this is emotional intensity, higher we go, the more intense it is, and say that this is how I experience the situation. I'm always at wherever this is. I'm at an 8. Okay. If I don't do anything to process or change the meaning, every time I enter that situation, I'm going to experience it at the same intensity. Oops. Let me go back. So it's really, really, if it's coming up over and over again, and I'm only using things like distraction, I'm only using avoidance, I'm only using suppression, I'm always going to be here at an 8. But if I use something to process and change my understanding of the situation, like reappraisal and acceptance, I might go down here to now 5. So now every time I go, and the next time I go and experience running into my ex, I'm actually at a 5. And last time I was at an 8. So it's not as bad. It's actually getting better. So suppression, again, we're really suppressing usually our physical expression. It takes some efforts. It often decreases positive emotions, but not negative ones, because we're still really feeling it. And it increases sympathetic nervous system activity. So there's a downside. We're by this, meaning we are a little bit more activated, a little bit more anxious. But that doesn't mean suppression is bad all the time, because it's actually very appropriate. So imagine that you're at a funeral and the person next to you farts. Okay, so if you're like me, I'm so terrible at suppressing or kind of forcing myself to be one way if I'm not feeling that. So if I'm like really wanting to laugh, it's going to probably look a lot like this, for me not to laugh. But it's very, very appropriate, because how rude would it be if I start laughing at a funeral? There are situations where suppression is adaptive. And so it's not always the gold standard, reappraisal and acceptance. And here's why. So we've got reappraisal is often, um, when we want to consider things to consider, or when we want to reconsider the gold standard, we want to think of these things here. So oftentimes, people with a history of non-suicidal self-injury, meaning that you're self-injuring but are not suicidal, often don't really benefit from reappraisal. Um, Often they are benefiting from more behavioral activities like that sleep, physical exercise, food. Um, Also, interpersonal reappraisal, me reappraising someone else's feelings. So, okay, your cat just died. Oh, like that sucks, but it's not so bad because your cat actually lived a long life, can sometimes feel really invalidating. Um, and here, we talked about, is it always good to downregulate negative emotions? Not always. So we have examples sometimes with negative self-conscious emotions like shame and guilt. Sometimes it's not good to try to downregulate it through appraisal, because sometimes, like, you really just need to sit with it and say, what is this feeling telling me? I cheated on a test, and I feel guilty about it. That's telling me something about me. We talked about grief. And acceptance, we want to be really careful what we accept, what we use acceptance on. So when a client comes to me, I'm never, ever, ever wanting to accept experiences of oppression. So oppression meaning experiencing things like racism, sexism, and going, oh, well, this happens, it's a part of the world. No, we're never going to sit and accept that. I'm not going to accept power, control, abuse, or any sort of injustice. When we talk about acceptance, we're not talking about forgiveness or getting over it or not caring. We're really talking about accepting our emotions, our experience, our thoughts about whatever situation. Doesn't matter about the situation. So really creating space to accept your own experience. And by doing that, we often decrease emotional intensity. Okay, so we have just covered a lot. We're going to go to the next video. And I know this section was just like a lot of information from the affective sciences. Feel free to review, rewatch parts of it. And we'll kind of continue, like, how do you actually apply these things? That's what we're going to cover in the next video.